this definitely does seem to be that the Russian front has collapsed a bit, and the offensive has widened. There are reports that the Ukrainians have retaken 2,500 square kilometers of territory, which they lost in the early days, and most importantly, around Kharkiv and the east. And the reason that that's important is the impact on the Russian logistics and their ability to sustain and support operations elsewhere in the east and northeast.
Look at some of the other front page stories, including, for a second day in a row, the front pages featuring this remarkable counterattack by Ukraine's military in the eastern part of the country. It appears to be the biggest reversal since Moscow first invaded. On Saturday evening, President Volodymyr Zelensky said in a video address the Ukrainian army had recaptured 2,000 square kilometres within a month. Well, now that figure stands at over 3,000 square kilometres. A little earlier, I caught up with Tim Cross, retired British Army officer and military logistics expert, and he told me more about the counteroffensive and why it's so significant.
The intent, which this started probably a couple of weeks ago, was to try and retake a couple of the cities that the Russians had taken very early on in the campaign. When we talk about a counteroffensive, we normally think of it across quite a wide frontage. And that wasn't the case initially, but what seems to be happening here, and what I think we've got to be careful. We need to be careful about what the Ukrainians are saying and what we're picking up. But this definitely does seem to be that the Russian front has collapsed a bit, and the offensive has widened. There are reports that the Ukrainians have retaken 2,500 square kilometers of territory, which they lost in the early days, and most importantly, around Kharkiv and the east. And the reason that that's important is the impact on the Russian logistics and their ability to sustain and support operations elsewhere in the east and northeast. So it's obviously gone well from a Ukrainian point of view, which is great. They seem to have sort of punched through a fairly thin line of the Russians. And I think what's really interesting in here, and we've got to be careful about speculating, but we've known for ages that the Russian morale is very poor. Their command and control is very poor. Their logistics has been incredibly lamentable, really. So it could collapse pretty quickly. Now, that said, and we need to be careful here, Putin is going to be up against it. And the real question is, if this is looking like it might be a major breakthrough, what is Putin going to do about it?
Yeah, because of course it would be a major humiliation for Vladimir Putin if this is all as Ukraine say it is. In fact, according to one expert, the advance marks the first time since World War II that whole Russian units have been lost. Again, we'd probably need to temper that a little and say that we're yet to get all the detail on it. Fighting continues, though, outside some of these supply towns that have been recaptured by Ukrainian troops. It's Izium and Kupiansk. So it's important for us to say, isn't it, that the Ukrainian forces are still fighting to gain control of a significant amount of area.
They are, and as I've said in a couple of times, both with yourselves and others in the media world, offensive operations are far more difficult than defensive operations. Thus far, the Ukrainians basically have been defending. But when you're on the offensive, and particularly when you begin to make rapid progress, then the danger is you start to outrun your logistics and your ability to sustain these operations. And because you're out in the open and you're on the move, you then become more vulnerable to counter battery fire, air attack, and so on. And it's difficult to believe that Putin will do nothing, or more importantly, the commanders on the ground will do nothing. But it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the whole thing is breaking apart. The question then is, can the Ukrainians maintain the momentum on this, as I say? And secondly, as they get closer to the Russian border, we're then, and again, I don't want to overplay this, but we've talked before about whether Putin would be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. I would hope the Ukrainians would realize that they should not cross into Russian territory. Otherwise, they are opening up all sorts of possibilities. And the issue over places like Crimea and so forth is, quite difficult in the sense that Russia does see Crimea very much as their territory.
Yes.
But what we're seeing here is, it's good news, and the military offensive is good. But most importantly, this is politically absolutely key. Because there's been no doubt at all, and I feel this, I felt this for some time, that the political will in Europe, in particular in places like Italy, France, Germany, Hungary, because of the energy crisis, a real feeling that they're not going to hold out in terms of these sanctions and over the energy and so forth through a winter. And Ukraine's Zelensky, no fool, he realizes that. So this is why the offensive has gone in now. The original plan for a major counteroffensive was the spring. I mean, I just know that for a fact. So, I think they brought this forward in an attempt to secure territory and send a very powerful message to Western Europe, which basically is, for Pete's sake, stick with us, stay with us on this.
Yes.
We can sustain and win this.
Let's get into the mind or the minds of the Ukrainian military, if we can. They say that their forces have taken over 3,000 square kilometres during this rapid counter-offensive. If that's correct, it means that their forces have tripled their stated gains in a little over 48 hours. That is the size of it. Tell me how they were able to do this. Do we need to admit that actually these northeastern areas, were perhaps more lightly speckled with Russian forces than other areas? And I'm thinking about the Donbass.
Yeah.
And also the fact that I believe the Ukrainian military had sort of indicated that they were more interested in Kherson, the southern city, the gateway city to those Black Sea ports, and that perhaps attention might have been on that area instead.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think the Russians. Well, I know the Russians moved some forces to help Kherson hold out, and therefore they will have moved assets from elsewhere and probably from this region we're talking about, from Kharkiv and so forth. Again, we've got to be careful in terms of square kilometers. Well, a lot of that is open countryside, and they may well have bypassed places that are being held out, towns and some of the cities and so forth, and moved past them, which is a good thing to have done, because if you can get behind them and cut off their supply lines and so on. So how much of this territory was heavily occupied by Russian forces, picking up your point, and how much of it has actually been secured, and as opposed to just they've moved their forces through it and so on. And we won't know the reality of that for 2 or 3 days at least, I would think. But again, this always works two ways. What you've got, forgive me, but I mean, British Army doctrine tells you that delivering fighting power is about the stuff, the equipment. We call that the physical component. It's about the conceptual component, about how you use that stuff in order to fight and win battles on a battlefield. But the crucial aspect of fighting power is what we in the British Army call the moral component. It's the will to win, the preparedness to die on the battlefield, to secure whatever it is your own forces are trying to do. And the Ukrainian moral component has been very powerful from the very beginning. And there's no doubt that the Russian moral component is, badly flawed and badly undermined. And this is not new. Napoleon said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So you can have shed loads of stuff, but if your moral component, if your ability, your willingness to fight is undermined, and your commanders, are not good leaders, and they abandoned, in some cases, there's been stories of Russian officers abandoning their troops and so on, then things can collapse very quickly. I mean, it's happened before, happened in World War I with the French mutiny. It's happened elsewhere on other battlefields. So we have to be careful here, but this could be the precursor to some pretty substantial changes. Now, if the Russians decide they're going to mobilize, they're going to move more people back in, etc., and they stabilize the situation, then, it's a different ballgame.
We've not really heard from Putin or the Russian defense minister about this counteroffensive, the successful, quite remarkable counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army. What we have done is we've heard from the Kremlin-appointed leader of Chechnya, who's appeared to criticize the Russian army's leadership. Yeah. It's been caught off guard, of course. That's his accusation. What will be happening right now in the Kremlin?
Well, what happens when things begin to go pear-shaped is that you get, lots of different reactions to that. Some people start to abandon ship pretty quickly. Others take a much harder line. There will be a group of people around, undoubtedly, who will begin to be thinking about a hard response to this, i.e. the use of tactical nuclear weapons, reinforcing, mobilizing. Putin cannot afford to lose this. Otherwise, he will, the strong danger is he will lose power. And there are people around him who are harder on the aggressive end of the spectrum than he is. There'll be others around who have been critical, and actually there've been quite a few voices that have become more public in their criticism of the campaign to begin with, actually, but also in the way that it's been conducted. And a lot of the generals, they've lost a lot of generals in the fighting. So some of these senior officers will be seeing their own careers collapsing around them. They will want to maybe, sideline themselves or separate themselves from Putin. And of course, we're talking about here trying to command a battlefield from Putin's point of view from Moscow, which is quite a long way away. So maintaining communications, understanding what is actually happening on the ground, and understanding what the commanders' plans are and how they're going to respond, etc., is never easy. So it's confusion. And leadership, the only time you see real leadership, say the only time, but the majority of the time you see real leadership is when people are under pressure. How do they react to that? And there are usually two ways. It's the fight or the flight reaction. Do we stern this up, reinforce, push back, or do we say, actually, this is not working and we've got to give up on it? And from a personal point of view, do people then dump on others and blame them, which will be Putin's, I think, natural reaction, or do they close in on themselves and become, they just retreat, in inverted commas? Now, I think it will be more the fight rather than the flight. And I think that these hard people around Putin could become quite influential. But, the bottom line is it's the troops on the ground who've got to stop this rout relatively quickly. And if they don't, and the Ukrainians keep on pushing forward, they could retake a lot of territory pretty quickly.
How would you be advising the Ukrainian military right now, Tim, in terms of capitalizing on this and also continuing to make advancements, because that will be their aim?
Yeah. It's about maintaining momentum. There's two issues here. One is there's another military maxim, if you like, which is not just British, but we talk about a culminating point. In other words, when you are on the offensive and you push forward, there comes a point where you have to stop and reassess, resupply, reposition yourself, and an operational pause. And I don't know what that looks like in the context of this offensive, but the first thing to be saying to them is, how are you going to sustain this momentum? How are you going to replace your losses? How are you going to reinforce where you are particularly successful and close down where you're not successful? And then maintain the momentum and then push on again. So it's the balance between allowing the forces to keep on pressing on and yet not suddenly finding themselves either being outflanked or running out of stuff, ammunition, etc., and making sure that they then don't find themselves being counterattacked, because that's what happens a lot in warfare. I mean, again, historically, there's lots of examples of this, but people pushing on, making big advances, they outrun themselves, and they then find themselves being outflanked, pushed back, and that momentum is lost. So that's the danger, and it's a matter of being. I say the word sensible, but not being cautious, but being sensible about the pace of what it is you're trying to do here, and that's not an easy balance to get. But if you've broken through and you're into pursuit operations, then it does change the picture.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the first Gulf War, when I was part of First Armored Division with General Rupert Smith, there were three things that could have happened. One would have been a big fight to break through the Iraqi positions. Secondly, a sort of pursuit and then a major counter offensive by the Iraqis. Or three, a major pursuit over several hundred kilometers of desert. And it's the latter that happened. And the issue there was maintaining the fuel stocks, maintaining the equipment, and ensuring that we could continue to pursue the Iraqis. And this will be the same thing here. It's, will they come across some stronger defensive positions and find themselves in a stronger firefight, or are they going to be pushing hard and pursuing the Russians back to the border and making sure they don't cross the border?
And the Ukrainian forces, heavily reliant on the West for weaponry as well. And they may have to take that operational pause, as you say, to allow more stocks of it to come in. I'd love to finish off, Tim, by just getting a bit of a reflection from you, really, as a retired British Army officer, on the loss of the Queen and the new King, King Charles III. I'm not sure if you've met either of them in your travels during your career at all, but if I could get a few thoughts from you on what's been a very sad week, really, in terms of losing the Queen. It
has been sad. Of course, it's not unexpected, but it's a shock nonetheless. I have met Her Majesty. She kindly presented me with my CBE in the palace. So I met her there. I met her in my army career several times. The highlight of which, in many ways, was the 50th anniversary of D-Day, which was held on the beaches of Arromanches in northern France, along with a number of other commemorations. But the beach parade was the finale of that whole week back in 1994. And I had the privilege of organizing that beach parade. We had 11,000 veterans on the beaches of Arromanches. My biggest fear that the tide would come in and some of them would die on the beaches, having survived D-Day. But anyway, the Queen and Prince Philip came over, and more members of the royal family on foreign soil than ever before. So we had a large number of them. And the Queen was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I went to the palace. We had all sorts of things happening over that period. But her relationship with the veterans. I mean, she was, of course, the last member of the royal family to have served in World War II. And so she had a real heart for the veterans. She had a real heart for the military. She's the colonel-in-chief of a number of army regiments, and I met her in that guise as well. So yes, I mean, I wouldn't, I met her on a number of occasions, but we weren't. I didn't see her close up on other times. The new king, I have met, and I'm very confident that he will be a great king. Actually, I mean, he's got. It's interesting, isn't it, that it's not that long ago that people were scoffing about him talking to the trees and so on. He's well ahead of his time in many of the big issues of today's world, climate change, environmental issues, and so on. He's passionate about young people, the Prince's Trust, and all the rest of it. And I've seen aspects of that through my own family, apart from us. So he too has strong links to the military, and the military have very powerful, very, very powerful feelings about the royal family. My commissioning certificate was to the Queen, not to politicians, not to short-term, here today, gone tomorrow, bunch of, I don't want to be unfair to them, but politicians. It was to Her Majesty. That's who my commission is. The armed forces serve our commander-in-chief. As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this relationship, and I've had the great privilege of meeting them and as I say, receiving my CB in the palace and hosting them at various events. It's a very, very strong relationship, and I for one I'm terribly sad that she's gone, but I'm very confident that Charles will make a great king.
That was Tim Cross, retired British Army officer and military logistics expert. It is